What makes a conqueror truly great? Is it the size of the empire they leave behind, the fear they inspire in their enemies, or the legacy that shapes centuries after their death? When you put Julius Caesar and Genghis Khan side by side, you're not just comparing two men, you're comparing two forces of nature. Caesar, the Roman general who turned a republic into an empire, whose name itself became synonymous with power, even centuries later in titles like Kaiser and Tsar. Genghis Khan, the Mongol warlord who rose from the harsh steppes with nothing, uniting scattered tribes and building the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. To different eras, to different worlds, but one burning question: who was history's ultimate conqueror? Let's dive into the story of ambition, blood, betrayal, and vision, and by the end, you'll have to choose where you stand. Let's begin with Caesar, born into a Rome that was already powerful. Caesar was ambitious from the very start. He didn't inherit a throne. He didn't emerge from obscurity. Instead, he clawed his way up through politics and the military, forging alliances, breaking them when convenient, and always keeping his eyes on the bigger prize. Rome at this time was a republic, but Caesar had bigger dreams. Through the Gallic Wars, he conquered vast territories, expanding Rome's reach to the Atlantic and bringing countless tribes under Roman rule. His campaigns weren't just military victories, they were political theater. Every victory was a message to Rome: Caesar is unstoppable. And Rome was forced to watch as he sent back reports of slaughtered armies, enslaved peoples, and mountains of gold. Caesar didn't just win battles, he made sure everyone knew about it. That is how you build a legend. But Genghis Khan's story starts differently. He wasn't born into a powerful city. He wasn't part of an established state. He was born as Temujin on the cold, unforgiving Mongolian steppe, where survival itself was uncertain. His father was poisoned when he was a boy. His family left destitute, abandoned by their clan. As a child, he learned hunger, betrayal, and the brutality of life. Yet from that harsh beginning, he rose, he gathered allies, crushed rivals, and built loyalty not on birthright but on merit. He rewarded skill, punished betrayal, and demanded absolute obedience. Slowly, the tribes that had warred for generations were brought under his banner. By the time he took the name Genghis Khan, universal ruler, he wasn't just another warlord. He was the embodiment of Mongol unity, a force destined to burst out of the steppe and rewrite the map of the world. Here's where the comparison gets fascinating. Caesar built on the foundation of Rome. He had legions, infrastructure, and wealth at his disposal, and he used them with ruthless precision. Genghis Khan, by contrast, built his empire from nothing. He took scattered horsemen and turned them into the most disciplined cavalry force the world had ever seen. His soldiers could ride for days, living off horse blood and milk, striking with terrifying speed. While Caesar perfected the art of siege and discipline, Genghis rewrote the rules of mobility and shock warfare, which is more impressive. The man who used the greatest army of his age to expand a republic into an empire, or the man who created an unstoppable war machine from the ashes of his childhood poverty. Caesar's ambition climaxed when he crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BCE. That moment wasn't just military, it was symbolic. He defied the Senate, defied the traditions of the Republic, and essentially declared, "Rome is mine." That single decision plunged Rome into civil war, and yet, against formidable rivals like Pompey, Caesar emerged victorious. He entered Rome not as a servant of the Senate, but as its master. Soon after, he was declared dictator for life. Caesar's conquest wasn't just on the battlefield, it was the conquest of a political system, the conquest of Rome itself. But that victory came with a price: his growing power and disregard for Republican traditions stirred fear. And in 44 BCE, on the Ides of March, those fears culminated in betrayal. Caesar was assassinated by men he once called allies. He died in the very city he had conquered, not at the hands of foreign enemies, but by his own senators. Greatness, it seems, came with daggers in the back. Genghis Khan's trajectory was different. His empire wasn't a city turned against him, but an endless wave of expansion outward. From Mongolia, he swept into northern China, crushing dynasties that had ruled for centuries. Then he turned west, storming through Central Asia, destroying cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, leaving trails of devastation. He didn't just conquer, he annihilated. Entire populations were massacred if they resisted. Fear was his greatest weapon. Cities surrendered rather than face his wrath. And when he moved further, toward Persia, toward Russia, his reputation preceded him like a storm. But here's the other side. Genghis wasn't just a destroyer, he was also a builder. He established laws, promoted trade across the Silk Road, and created one of the first truly global networks of communication. Under his empire, merchants, scholars, and ideas flowed across continents. He conquered with terror, but he ruled with vision. So let me ask you, who do you think was greater? Caesar, who mastered the game of politics and the art of propaganda, who took a republic and turned it into an empire with his name etched in history, or Genghis Khan, who rose from nothing, created the largest land empire ever, and reshaped civilizations from China to Europe? Caesar died betrayed by his peers, his empire fragmented but reborn in the hands of Augustus. Genghis died undefeated, his empire still expanding after his death, carried on by his sons and grandsons. Which legacy weighs heavier? The brilliance of Rome's most ambitious son, or the unstoppable force of the Mongol steppe? The debate begins here. To compare Caesar and Genghis Khan as conquerors, we need to understand not just their victories, but the way they fought, the genius behind their tactics. Because greatness on the battlefield isn't only about numbers, it's about ideas, about shaping war itself. And here, both men stood as innovators. Caesar, with his disciplined legions, turned battles into lessons in precision and control. Genghis, with his cavalry, turned the chaos of the steppe into an unstoppable hurricane. Each redefined what warfare meant for their age. Let's begin with Caesar's legions. These weren't ordinary soldiers. A Roman legion was a machine drilled endlessly. Each man trained to fight information, to hold discipline even in chaos. Caesar understood this better than anyone. He took the discipline and combined it with speed and daring. At Alesia, during the Gallic Wars, he faced Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who united tribes against him. Caesar's army was outnumbered, trapped between a fortress on the hill and a massive relief army coming to break the siege. Most generals would have collapsed under that pressure. Caesar didn't. He built two walls, one encircling the fortress, the other facing outward against the relief force, surrounded himself. He surrounded his enemy twice over, and against all odds. He won. Alesia became a masterpiece of siege warfare, the kind of battle still studied today. That was Caesar, the master of discipline, the master of engineering solutions under impossible pressure. Now look at Genghis Khan. His genius wasn't in walls, it was in movement. The Mongol cavalry was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Light horsemen, each with multiple horses, could ride for days without stopping. They could fire arrows accurately while galloping at full speed, raining death before enemies even reached them. Genghis perfected the art of feigned retreat, pretending to flee in panic, drawing enemies into pursuit, only to turn suddenly and encircle them with fresh cavalry. This tactic annihilated larger, slower armies that thought victory was at hand. Against heavily armored knights in Eastern Europe, the Mongols looked like fragile riders. But those knights never returned home. Speed, deception, and coordination made Genghis invincible. Unlike Caesar, who relied on the iron discipline of infantry, Genghis wielded the mobility of cavalry like a weapon the world had never encountered. And here's the fascinating part. Both men used psychology as much as weapons. Caesar wrote his own commentaries on the Gallic Wars, ensuring that back in Rome, his people read about his victories in his own words. He turned warfare into propaganda, shaping his image as the savior of Rome, the man destined for greatness. Every battle wasn't just fought on the battlefield, it was fought on the pages of history. Caesar made sure no one could ignore his brilliance. Genghis Khan, on the other hand, wielded fear itself. His massacres were calculated. Entire cities were destroyed not simply for conquest, but for reputation. When word spread that resisting the Mongols meant certain extermination, entire towns surrendered without a fight. His brutality wasn't mindless, it was strategic. Fear was as much a tool of conquest as the bow or the sword. But what about scale? Caesar expanded Rome's territory massively: Gaul, much of modern France, Belgium, parts of Germany and Britain. Yet in comparison, Genghis's empire dwarfed it. At its height, the Mongol Empire stretched from China to Eastern Europe, from Siberia to Persia. It connected East and West in a way the world had never seen. Caesar built the foundations of an empire that lasted centuries. Genghis created the largest contiguous empire ever. Which achievement is greater? That depends on whether you value longevity or sheer scale. Still, scale isn't everything. Caesar's genius was personal. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a political visionary. He knew Rome itself had to be conquered before he could be truly great. His crossing of the Rubicon was more than an act of war, it was an act of defiance against an entire political system. Caesar understood that real power wasn't only about land, it was about control of Rome itself. That's why he was assassinated in the Senate, not on the battlefield. He fought his greatest war not against Gauls or Germans, but against the idea of the Roman Republic. Genghis, in contrast, was building something entirely new. He wasn't inheriting an old system, he was creating a new one. He created a code of laws, the Yasa, to govern his vast territories. He promoted meritocracy, elevating men based on skill rather than birth. For a man who grew up abandoned, betrayed, and hunted, that was revolutionary. His empire wasn't simply about conquest. It was about unity. He took tribes that had slaughtered each other for generations and forged them into a single identity: Mongols. That transformation wasn't just political. It was cultural, spiritual. He created a nation where there had only been chaos. So here's the question. Do we measure greatness by the brilliance of military tactics, by the size of the empire, or by the transformation of society itself? Caesar was a genius of politics and propaganda, a man whose personal ambition transformed Rome forever. Genghis was a force of nature, a man who took the weakest tribes and turned them into masters of the world. Both were brilliant, both ruthless, both unforgettable. But only one can be called the ultimate conqueror. Which one? That's for you to decide. To understand Caesar and Genghis Khan, we can't just look at their armies and conquests. We need to look at how they dealt with allies, enemies, and betrayal. Because greatness isn't just measured in victories, it's measured in how you keep power, how you hold loyalty, and how you deal with those who dared to stand in your way. And in this dimension, Caesar and Genghis could not be more different, yet both reveal what true power demands. Caesar lived in a world of politics as much as battlefields. Every victory he achieved in Gaul wasn't just about land. It was about building his personal reputation back in Rome. He needed allies to rise, figures like Pompey and Crassus in the so-called First Triumvirate. But Caesar also knew alliances were temporary. When Pompey became a rival, Caesar didn't hesitate to turn against him. That's the thing about Caesar. Loyalty was always conditional. He gave rewards, land, and prestige to soldiers who followed him. And in return, they became loyal to him, not to Rome. His legions were not just Roman soldiers, they were Caesar's soldiers. That shift was monumental. For centuries, Rome's power had rested on the idea that legions served the republic. Caesar broke that tradition, making them servants of his own ambition. And when he crossed the Rubicon, it was that loyalty that carried him forward. But betrayal haunted him as well. Even his allies in the Senate, men he spared or elevated, turned against him. Brutus, a man Caesar treated like a son, drove the dagger into him. That's the paradox of Caesar's greatness. The more power he gathered, the more fear he inspired. And the more his own people betrayed him. His legacy was stained with blood, not just on foreign soil, but on the Senate floor of his own city. This story shows us that in politics, allies are only friends until ambition makes them enemies. Now, Genghis Khan's path was forged in betrayal from the very start. As a boy, his father's allies abandoned his family after poisoning him. His childhood was one of hunger and fear. His half-brother tried to dominate him. Temujin killed him. That early life shaped how he ruled as Genghis. Betrayal was never forgiven. Loyalty was rewarded generously, but disloyalty meant annihilation, and unlike Caesar, who tolerated rivals until they became threats, Genghis eradicated threats before they could grow. When tribes betrayed him, he destroyed them completely, scattering survivors so they could never rise again. This ruthless policy built an empire of loyalty through fear. But it wasn't only fear. Genghis was surprisingly progressive in some ways. He elevated men from humble origins into high ranks if they proved loyal and skilled. His generals weren't all blood relatives or nobles, they were men who had earned their place on the battlefield. That meritocracy created an intense loyalty. Soldiers knew that following Genghis meant opportunity. Caesar rewarded loyalty too, but within the limits of Roman class and politics. Genghis shattered those limits, building an empire on loyalty that transcended birthright. When it came to enemies, Caesar often showed mercy, at least when it suited him. After defeating Pompey's supporters, he pardoned many of them, trying to show magnanimity. It was both strategy and arrogance. By sparing them, he reinforced his superiority. But, ironically, that mercy may have cost him his life. The very men he forgave became the conspirators who killed him. Mercy, in Caesar's world, was a double-edged sword. It made him look powerful, but it left daggers lurking in the shadows. Genghis had no such illusions. Mercy was rare, and only extended when it served a larger purpose. Entire cities that resisted him were slaughtered, their populations erased. Those who surrendered quickly were spared and often integrated into his empire, sometimes even recruited as soldiers or craftsmen. To Genghis, mercy was a calculated tactic, never an ideal. And because of that, betrayal was almost impossible if you dared to resist once his reputation spread. If Caesar ruled with charisma and politics, Genghis ruled with terror and inevitability. Now think about loyalty again. Caesar inspired his men with promises of land, citizenship, and glory. They loved him not just as a commander, but as a man who shared their hardships. He marched with them, fought with them, addressed them with speeches that stirred hearts. When he said, "I am Caesar," they believed they were part of something legendary. But that loyalty was personal. It lived and died with him. After his assassination, Rome spiraled into civil war until Augustus emerged. Caesar's system wasn't sustainable without Caesar himself. Genghis, by contrast, built loyalty into the very fabric of his empire. His laws, his rewards, his ruthless punishments, they created a system where loyalty was not optional but necessary for survival. Even after his death, his sons and grandsons continued to expand his empire, riding the momentum of the system he built. That's the difference. Caesar's loyalty was personal. Genghis's loyalty was institutional. Which is greater? The man who could inspire love and devotion in life, or the man who built a structure that carried his will beyond death? So again, we are forced to ask, who was the greater conqueror? Caesar, who bent the greatest republic of his time to his personal will, inspiring men to follow him even against Rome itself, only to fall to betrayal within his own Senate? Or Genghis, who rose from nothing, forged absolute loyalty through a mix of merit and terror, and built an empire so strong it endured even after he was gone? Perhaps the answer depends on what you value more. Do you admire Caesar's charisma and brilliance, even if it ended in a pool of blood on the Senate floor? Or do you admire Genghis's cold efficiency, his ability to crush betrayal and build something that lasted beyond himself, even if it was built on mountains of skulls? The debate isn't just about history. It's about the kind of leadership we admire and the kind of greatness we believe defines an empire. Greatness doesn't end with death. It echoes in what comes after, in the empires and the legends that follow. If we want to compare Caesar and Genghis Khan, we can't just stop at their lives, we need to look at their legacies. Because sometimes, the true measure of a conqueror is not what he built for himself, but what he left behind for the world. And here, their stories take strikingly different paths. Let's start with Caesar. His assassination in 44 BCE could have ended his dream. Daggers on the Senate floor cut him down before he could complete his vision. But here's the irony. killing Caesar didn't end his power, it immortalized it. His death triggered a civil war that shattered the old republic and paved the way for Augustus, his adopted heir, to rise as the first emperor of Rome. The republic that had stood for centuries was gone, replaced by an empire that would last for hundreds of years. In other words, Caesar's assassination ensured his victory. His dream of empire, his belief that Rome must be ruled by one man, became reality after his death. Isn't that a strange kind of triumph? He died, but his vision lived. Even his name became eternal. Caesar was no longer just a man, it became a title. Emperors after him bore it with pride. Centuries later, in Germany, rulers called themselves Kaiser. In Russia, they called themselves Tsar. Both words came from Caesar. Think about that. His very name became synonymous with power across continents and centuries. That's legacy, not just armies, not just land, but a brand of authority so strong it transcended language and culture. Caesar might not have lived to rule as emperor, but the idea of Caesar ruled the world for centuries. Now, Genghis Khan. If Caesar gave his name to kings, Genghis gave his blood to nations. His descendants ruled vast empires that reshaped Eurasia. His sons and grandsons expanded them. Mongol Empire far beyond what he achieved in his lifetime. Under Decoded, the Mongols pushed deep into Eastern Europe, reaching Poland and Hungary, terrifying Christendom itself. Under Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, the Mongols conquered China and established the Yuan Dynasty, ruling as emperors in the heart of the Middle Kingdom. At one point, the empire stretched from Korea to the edge of Europe, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. That was Genghis's true legacy, the largest contiguous empire in history. But it wasn't just about territory. Genghis reshaped the world in ways people often forget. The Pax Mongolica, the peace of the Mongols, created an era where trade and communication flourished across Eurasia. The Silk Road was safer under Mongol rule than it had ever been. Merchants could travel from Venice to Beijing, carrying goods, ideas, and cultures, technologies, philosophies. Even diseases spread because of the networks Genghis built. Some of the most important exchanges in world history: the spread of gunpowder, the movement of printing, the transmission of knowledge were made possible because of the Mongol Empire. In short, Genghis didn't just conquer, he connected. But legacy is never simple. Caesar's empire brought stability to Rome, but also tyranny. The republic was gone. And with it, the ideals of shared governance. The emperors that followed were not all wise. Some were monsters: Caligula, Nero. Domitian. These names remind us that Caesar's legacy was double-edged. He created empire, yes, but also paved the way for despotism. Was that greatness, or was it the death of freedom? That's for you to decide. Genghis's legacy, too, has shadows. His conquests left millions dead. Cities like Nishapur were reduced to rubble and ashes. Entire populations slaughtered. His terror reshaped landscapes as much as his vision did. For some cultures, Genghis is remembered as a hero, a unifier. For others, he is remembered as a destroyer, a scourge. Even today, his memory divides. In Mongolia, he is revered as a national father. In parts of the Middle East, he is remembered as a bringer of devastation. Legacy is perspective. To some, he was a genius. To others, he was apocalypse. And yet, can we deny the reach of his influence? Genetic studies suggest that as many as 16 million men alive today carry the Y chromosome lineage traced back to Genghis Khan. His bloodline is literally woven into humanity. Caesar gave us titles. Genghis gave us descendants. Which is more powerful, a name that crowns rulers, or a bloodline that flows through millions? We must also consider cultural impact. Rome, under Caesar's shadow, shaped Western civilization, law, architecture, engineering. Even language. Latin spread because Caesar and his successors expanded Rome, the calendar you use. Today, the Julian calendar, named after Caesar. July itself is named for him, even in the daily lives of people. Caesar's mark is present. Genghis's influence is different. He didn't leave calendars or months in his name, but he left roads, roots, and the idea of a connected world, the globalization we take for granted began. In many ways, with the Mongol Empire, he made the world smaller, for better or worse. So here's the question: whose legacy shaped humanity more? Caesar, whose vision of centralized power and empire defined Western civilization, who turned his name into a symbol of authority, or Genghis Khan, who redrew the map of the world, created networks of trade and exchange, and whose blood still flows in millions today? Do we value the permanence of an idea, or the tangible reach of an empire that touched continents? Both men prove something essential about power: it never truly dies with the man it echoes. Caesar's assassination was supposed to end him, but it made him immortal. Genghis's death was supposed to halt his expansion, but it unleashed generations of Mongol rulers who carved history deeper. Their legacies are not just about land, but about what humanity became because of them. So here we stand, at the end of two stories separated by time, culture, and geography, but united by one burning question: who was history's ultimate conqueror, Caesar or Genghis Khan? To answer, we need to weigh not only victories and empires, but the essence of what greatness means, and maybe, just maybe, the real answer depends less on them and more on us. Think again of Caesar. He was not born an outsider. He grew up in the heart of Rome, in a society already powerful and advanced. Yet he dared to reach higher. He saw a republic bound by tradition, and he smashed those traditions to carve out his destiny. His military brilliance in Gaul, his political cunning in Rome, his audacious march across the Rubicon, these were acts of genius and defiance. And yet, his greatness was cut short, betrayed, stabbed 23 times by men he once called allies. Caesar died on the floor of the Senate. But here's the twist: death made him eternal. Without Caesar's assassination, would Augustus have risen to create the Roman Empire? Would Rome have endured as the central power of the Western world? Caesar's greatness lay not just in what he did, but in how his death transformed everything that followed. He became a symbol of warning, a legend, a name carried across millennia. Now, picture Genghis Khan. His beginning couldn't have been more different. No marble columns, no Senate halls, just the open steppe, the wind, the struggle for survival. He had no system to inherit. He built one from nothing, and he built it larger than anyone before or after. He united warring tribes, created an empire that stretched across continents, and reshaped the course of history. He conquered with terror, but ruled with vision. His empire connected east and west, allowed trade and culture to flow, and even shaped genetics. He died undefeated, his empire still surging forward. Unlike Caesar, who was cut down by betrayal, Genghis died in command of everything he had built. His greatness was not in dying a martyr, but in proving that even the harshest beginnings could give birth to world-changing power. And so, the question lingers: do we value Caesar's charisma, his brilliance, his audacity to transform Rome itself, even if he was undone by his own people? Or do we value Genghis's raw force, his ability to bend the world to his will, leaving behind not just land, but a bloodline and a network that connected continents? Caesar gave us the idea of the emperor. Genghis gave us the reality of empire on a scale the world had never seen. Some might argue that Caesar's greatness lies in the fact that his name became a symbol of rulership across cultures. Long after Rome fell, rulers still wanted to be Caesars. Others might argue that Genghis's greatness lies in his tangible impact, the trade routes, the empire, the sheer scale of his conquests. Caesar's greatness is an idea. Genghis's greatness is a reality carved into the earth. Which matters more? But perhaps the real truth is this: they were both necessary. Caesar embodied the brilliance of ambition within a system, bending Rome to his will and reshaping Western civilization. Genghis embodied the power of raw creation, forging something out of nothing, uniting chaos into order. Caesar taught us the danger and the allure of personal power. Genghis taught us that even the most unlikely beginnings can lead to unmatched dominance. Their greatness is not mutually exclusive, it is complementary. They show us two paths to immortality: through ideas or through scale. And maybe that's why we still debate them, because in each of us, there's a little of Caesar and a little of Genghis. Part of us craves the brilliance of the strategist, the man who seizes destiny with a stroke of boldness. Another part craves the sheer force of will, the ability to bend the impossible into reality. Caesar and Genghis live on not just in history, books, but in the way we imagine power, ambition, and greatness itself. So let me put the question directly to you. If you had to follow one into battle, would you choose Caesar, the master of politics and precision, who could turn even impossible odds into victory? Or would you choose Genghis, the unstoppable storm, who promised not just survival, but domination of the world? If you had to decide who was the greatest conqueror of all time, whose side would you stand on? Caesar, whose death gave birth to empire, or Genghis, whose life gave birth to the largest empire the world has ever seen? There is no single right answer. That's the beauty of history. The debate itself is what keeps their names alive. Caesar versus Genghis Khan is not just about the past, it's about how we define greatness today. Do we admire the visionary or the destroyer? The builder of systems or the breaker of worlds? The man who became a symbol or the man who became a legend written into the blood of humanity? Comment your answer. Defend it. Argue it. Was Caesar truly the ultimate conqueror, or does the crown belong to Genghis Khan? Their stories are finished, but the debate is ours to continue. And as long as we ask the question, both men remain what they always were, giants who cast shadows across the centuries, daring us to choose which shadow we find greater.